Welcome to Module 5, Programs and Practice Models for Depression. So going forward, when we're talking about emerging practice models and programs, we're going to follow a similar overview. We'll start with a review of the current state of practice, and then we'll move into emerging practices and models. We'll evaluate the degree to which they address gaps or needs and consider the needs for translational research, training, and other resources. A little bit of background about depression. We know that it is one of the most common, chronic, and recurring mental health disorders facing both individuals in the United States as well as globally. Amongst children, it is estimated that between 1 and 3% of kids have or meet criteria for depressive disorder, and that there is an uptick in adolescence where rates have been shown to be as high as 1 in every 4 adolescents who meet criteria. In adulthood, it is expected, or it has been estimated, that 10% of men and up to 20% of women experience depression annually. And over the lifetime, women are more likely, with the exception of childhood, where rates seem to be the same as with males, that females exhibit a prevalence rate that is twice as high of men throughout adolescence and adulthood. We also know that living in poverty and being impacted for poverty is a consistent threat to the emotional health of individuals, and that rates of depression amongst poverty-impacted individuals is up to 25%. We also know that depression is globally estimated to afflict something like 350 million individuals annually, and the public burden or the societal burden associated with having a depressive disorder is tremendous. Amongst adolescents experiencing depression, there are pretty clear risks and negative outcomes. It impacts their academic functioning, their social functioning, their health. There's a high comorbidity between depression and other mental health and substance use disorders, as well as health conditions. In addition, if an individual is diagnosed or has an onset before the age of 12, that seems to be linked to poor outcomes in terms of functioning, having more episodes of depression across their lifespan, and an increased risk of suicide. Many adolescents who experience depression will go on to have a recurrence during adulthood. And we know adulthood depression is associated with additional risks to functioning and health, including employment difficulties, meaning being unemployed, missing work days, reduced productivity, comorbid health and mental health problems, such as poor cardiovascular health, stroke, diabetes, and premature morbidity and mortality. In the U.S. alone, depression is estimated to cost over $200 billion annually due to treatment for the disorder, as well as comorbid health issues and mental health conditions, reduced productivity in the workplace, and job loss. And according to the World Health Organization, depression is the leading cause of disability worldwide, and it has been identified as a public health crisis. So this link, if you copy and paste it into a browser, will take you to Andrew Solomon, and he is a fairly prolific writer about depression and mental health issues. And in this TED Talk, which is about 29 minutes long, he describes his own personal experience with depression and really gives you an insider's look as to what it's like to experience a depressive episode or multiple depressive episodes. The flip side of it is that he talks very eloquently about how his experience in sharing it has led others to seek him out and form somewhat of a community and decrease the social isolation that a lot of individuals with mental health conditions experience because of shame, stigma, and other perceptual issues that interfere both with help seeking, but also lead someone to become isolated and feel very much alone with what they're experiencing.
I felt a funeral in my brain, and mourners to and fro kept treading till I felt that sense was breaking through. And when they all were seated, a service like a drum kept beating till I felt my mind was going numb. And then I heard them lift a box and creak across my soul with those same boots of lead again. Then space began to toll, as if the heavens were a bell, and being were an ear, and I and silence some strange race, wrecked, solitary here. Just then, a plank in reason broke, and I fell down and hit a world at every plunge, and finished knowing then. We know depression through metaphors. Emily Dickinson was able to convey it in language, Goya in an image. Half the purpose of art is to describe such iconic states. As for me, I had always thought myself tough, one of the people who could survive if I'd been sent to a concentration camp. In 1991, I had a series of losses. My mother died, a relationship I'd been in ended, I moved back to the United States from some years abroad, and I got through all of those experiences intact. But in 1994, 3 years later, I found myself losing interest in almost everything. I didn't want to do any of the things I had previously wanted to do, and I didn't know why. The opposite of depression is not happiness, but vitality. And it was vitality that seemed to seep away from me in that moment. Everything there was to do seemed like too much work. I would come home and I would see the red light flashing on my answering machine. And instead of being thrilled to hear from my friends, I would think, what a lot of people that is to have to call back. Or I would decide I should have lunch, and then I would think, but I'd have to get the food out and put it on a plate and cut it up and chew it and swallow it. And it felt to me like the Stations of the Cross. And one of the things that often gets lost in discussions of depression is that you know it's ridiculous. You know it's ridiculous while you're experiencing it. You know that most people manage to listen to their messages and eat lunch and organize themselves to take a shower and go out the front door, and that it's not a big deal. And yet, you are nonetheless in its grip, and you are unable to figure out any way around it. And so I began to feel myself doing less and thinking less and feeling less. It was a kind of nullity, and then the anxiety set in. If you told me that I have to be depressed for the next month, I would say as long as I know it'll be over in November, I can do it. But if you said to me, you have to have acute anxiety for the next month, I would rather slit my wrist than go through it. It was the feeling all the time, like that feeling you have if you're walking and you slip or trip and the ground is rushing up at you, but instead of lasting half a second the way that does, it lasted for 6 months. It's a sensation of being afraid all the time, but not even knowing what it is that you're afraid of. And it was at that point that I began to think that it was just too painful to be alive, and that the only reason not to kill oneself was so as not to hurt other people. And finally one day, I woke up and I thought perhaps I'd had a stroke, because I lay in bed completely frozen, looking at the telephone, thinking something is wrong and I should call for help. And I couldn't reach out my arm and pick up the phone and dial. And finally, after 4 full hours of my lying and staring at it, the phone rang, and somehow I managed to pick it up. And it was my father. And I said, I'm in serious trouble. We need to do something. The next day, I started with the medications and the therapy. And I also started reckoning with this terrible question. If I'm not the tough person who could have made it through a concentration camp, then who am I? And if I have to take medication, is that medication making me more fully myself? Or is it making me someone else? And how do I feel about it if it's making me someone else? I had two advantages as I went into the fight. The first is that I knew that, objectively speaking, I had a nice life, and that if I could only get well, there was something at the other end that was worth living for. And the other was that I had access to good treatment. But I nonetheless emerged and relapsed, and emerged and relapsed, and emerged and relapsed, and finally understood I would have to be on medication and in therapy forever. And I thought, but is it a chemical problem or a psychological problem? And does it need a chemical cure or a philosophical cure? And I couldn't figure out which it was. And then I understood that actually we aren't advanced enough in either area for it to explain things fully. The chemical cure and the psychological cure both have a role to play. And I also figured out that depression was something that was braided so deep into us that there was no separating it from our character and personality. I want to say that the treatments we have for depression are appalling. They're not very effective. They're extremely costly. They come with innumerable side effects. They're a disaster. But I am so grateful that I live now and not 50 years ago, when there would have been almost nothing to be done. I hope that 50 years hence, people will hear about my treatments and be appalled that anyone endured such primitive science. Depression is the flaw in love. If you were married to someone and thought, well, if my wife dies, I'll find another one, it wouldn't be love as we know it. There's no such thing as love without the anticipation of loss, and that specter of despair can be the engine of intimacy. There are three things people tend to confuse: depression, grief, and sadness. Grief is explicitly reactive. If you have a loss and you feel incredibly unhappy, and then 6 months later you're still deeply sad but you're functioning a little better, it's probably grief, and it will probably ultimately resolve itself in some measure. If you experience a catastrophic loss and you feel terrible, and 6 months later you can barely function at all, then it's probably a depression that was triggered by the catastrophic circumstances. The trajectory tells us a great deal. People think of depression as being just sadness. It's much, much too much sadness, much too much grief at far too slight a cause. As I set out to understand depression and to interview people who had experienced it, I found that there were people who seemed, on the surface, to have what sounded like relatively mild depression, who were nonetheless utterly disabled by it. And there were other people who had what sounded, as they described it, like terribly severe depression, who nonetheless had good lives in the interstices between their depressive episodes. And I set out to find out what it is that causes some people to be more resilient than other people. What are the mechanisms that allow people to survive? And I went out and I interviewed person after person who was suffering with depression. One of the first people I interviewed described depression as a slower way of being dead. And that was a good thing for me to hear early on, because it reminded me that that slow way of being dead can lead to actual deadness, that this is a serious business. It's the leading disability worldwide, and people die of it every day. One of the people I talked to when I was trying to understand this was a beloved friend who I had known for many years and who had had a psychotic episode in her freshman year of college and then plummeted into a horrific depression. She had bipolar illness, or manic depression as it was then known. And then she did very well for many years on lithium, and then eventually she was taken off her lithium to see how she would do without it. And she had another psychosis, and then plunged into the worst depression that I had ever seen, in which she sat in her parents' apartment, more or less catatonic, essentially without moving, day after day after day. And when I interviewed her about that experience some years later, She's a poet and psychotherapist named Maggie Robbins. When I interviewed her, she said, I was singing, "Where have all the flowers gone?" over and over to occupy my mind. I was singing to blot out the things my mind was saying, which were, you are nothing. You are nobody. You don't even deserve to live. And that was when I really started thinking about killing myself. You don't think in depression that you've put on a gray veil and are seeing the world through the haze of a bad mood. You think that the veil has been taken away, the veil of happiness, and that now you're seeing truly. It's easier to help schizophrenics who perceive that there's something foreign inside of them that needs to be exorcised, but it's difficult with depressives because we believe we are seeing the truth. But the truth lies. I became obsessed with that sentence, but the truth lies. And I discovered as I talked to depressive people that they have many delusional perceptions. People will say, no one loves me, and you say, I love you, your wife loves you, your mother loves you. You can answer that one pretty readily, at least for most people. But people who are depressed will also say, no matter what we do, we're all just going to die in the end. Or they'll say, there can be no true communion between two human beings. Each of us is trapped in his own body. To which you have to say, that's true, but I think we should focus right now on what to have for breakfast. A lot of the time, what they are expressing is not illness, but insight. And one comes to think what's really extraordinary is that most of us know about those existential questions, and they don't distract us very much. There was a study I particularly liked in which a group of depressed and a group of non-depressed people were asked to play a video game for an hour. And at the end of the hour, they were asked how many little monsters they thought they had killed. The depressive group was usually accurate to within about 10%. And the non-depressed people guessed between 15 and 20 times as many little monsters as they had actually killed. A lot of people said when I chose to write about my depression that it must be very difficult to be out of that closet, to have people know. They said, do people talk to you differently? And I said, yes, people talk to me differently. They talk to me differently insofar as they start telling me about their experience or their sister's experience or their friend's experience. Things are different because now I know that depression is the family secret that everyone has. I went a few years ago to a conference, and on Friday of the 3-day conference, one of the participants took me aside and she said, I suffer from depression and I'm a little embarrassed about it, but I've been taking this medication and I just wanted to ask you what you think. And so I did my best to give her such advice as I could. And then she said, you know, my husband would never understand this. He's really the kind of guy to whom this wouldn't make any sense. So it's just between us. And I said, yes, that's fine. On Sunday at the same conference, her husband took me aside. And he said, my wife wouldn't think that I was really much of a guy if she knew this, but I've been dealing with this depression and I'm taking some medication and I wondered what you think. They were hiding the same medication in 2 different places in the same bedroom. And I said that I thought communication within the marriage might be triggering some of their problems. But I was also struck by the burdensome nature of such mutual secrecy. Depression is so exhausting. It takes up so much of your time and energy, and silence about it, it really does make the depression worse. And then I began thinking about all the ways people make themselves better. I'd started off as a medical conservative. I thought there were a few kinds of therapy that worked. It was clear what they were. There was medication, there were certain psychotherapies, there was possibly electroconvulsive treatment, and that everything else was nonsense. But then I discovered something. If you have brain cancer and you say that standing on your head for 20 minutes every morning makes you feel better, it may make you feel better, but you still have brain cancer and you'll still probably die from it. But if you say that you have depression and standing on your head for 20 minutes every day makes you feel better, then it's worked, because depression is an illness of how you feel. And if you feel better, then you're effectively not depressed anymore. So I became much more tolerant of the vast world of alternative treatments. And I get letters. I get hundreds of letters from people writing to tell me about what's worked for them. Someone was asking me backstage today about meditation. My favorite of the letters that I got was the one that came from a woman who wrote and said that she had tried therapy, she had tried medication, she had tried pretty much everything, and she had found a solution and hoped I would tell the world. And that was making little things from yarn. She sent me some of them, and I'm not wearing them right now. I suggested to her that she also should look up obsessive-compulsive disorder in the DSM. And yet, when I went to look at alternative treatments, I also gained perspective on other treatments. I went through a tribal exorcism in Senegal that involved a great deal of ram's blood, and that I'm not going to detail right now. But a few years afterwards, I was in Rwanda working on a different project, and I happened to describe my experience to someone. And he said, well, you know, that's West Africa, and we're in East Africa, and our rituals are in some ways very different, but we do have some rituals that have something in common with what you're describing. And I said, oh, and he said, yes. He said, but we've had a lot of trouble with Western mental health workers, especially the ones who came right after the genocide. And I said, what kind of trouble did you have? And he said, well, he said they would do this bizarre thing. He said they didn't take people out in the sunshine where you begin to feel better. They didn't include drumming or music to get people's blood going. They didn't involve the whole community. They didn't externalize the depression as an invasive spirit. Instead, what they did was they took people, one at a time, into dingy little rooms and had them talk for an hour about bad things that had happened to them. He said, we had to ask them to leave the country. Now, at the other end of alternative treatments, let me tell you about Frank Russakoff. Frank Russakoff had the worst depression, perhaps, that I've ever seen in a man. He was constantly depressed. He was, when I met him, at a point at which every month he would have electroshock treatment. Then he would feel sort of disoriented for a week. Then he would feel okay for a week. Then he would have a week of going downhill. And then he would have another electroshock treatment. And he said to me when I met him, it's unbearable to go through my weeks this way. I can't go on this way, and I figured out how I'm going to end it if I don't get better. But, he said to me, I heard about a protocol at Mass General for a procedure called a cingulotomy, which is a brain surgery, and I think I'm going to give that a try. And I remember being amazed at that point to think that someone who clearly had so many bad experiences with so many different treatments still had buried in him somewhere enough optimism to reach out for one more. And he had the cingulotomy, and it was incredibly successful. He's now a friend of mine. He has a lovely wife and 2 beautiful children. He wrote me a letter the Christmas after the surgery, and he said, my father sent me 2 presents this year. First, a motorized CD rack from the Sharper Image that I didn't really need, but I knew he was giving it to me to celebrate the fact that I'm living on my own and have a job I seem to love. And the other present was a photo of my grandmother, who committed suicide. As I unwrapped it, I began to cry, and my mother came over and said, are you crying because of the relatives you never knew? And I said, she had the same disease I have. I'm crying now as I write to you. It's not that I'm so sad, but I get overwhelmed. I think because I could have killed myself, but my parents kept me going, and so did the doctors, and I had the surgery. I'm alive and grateful. We live in the right time, even if it doesn't always feel like it. I was struck by the fact that depression is broadly perceived to be a modern Western middle-class thing, and I went to look at how it operated in a variety of other contexts. And one of the things I was most interested in was depression among the indigent. And so I went out to try to look at what was being done for poor people with depression. And what I discovered is that poor people are mostly not being treated for depression. Depression is the result of a genetic vulnerability, which is presumably evenly distributed in the population, and triggering circumstances, which are likely to be more severe for people who are impoverished. And yet, it turns out that if you have a really lovely life but feel miserable all the time, you think, why do I feel like this? I must have depression. And you set out to find treatment for it. But if you have a perfectly awful life and you feel miserable all the time, the way you feel is commensurate with your life. And it doesn't occur to you to think, maybe this is treatable. And so we have an epidemic in this country of depression among impoverished people that's not being picked up and that's not being treated and that's not being addressed. And it's a tragedy of a grand order. And so I found an academic who was doing a research project in slums outside of DC, where she picked up women who had come in for other health problems and diagnosed them with depression, and then provided 6 months of experimental protocol. One of them, Lolly, came in, and this is what she said the day she came in. She said, and she was a woman, by the way, who had 7 children. She said, I used to have a job, but I had to give it up because I couldn't go out of the house. I have nothing to say to my children. In the morning, I can't wait for them to leave, and then I climb in bed and pull the covers over my head. And 3 o'clock when they come home, it just comes so fast. She said, I've been taking a lot of Tylenol, anything I can take so that I can sleep more. My husband has been telling me I'm stupid, I'm ugly. I wish I could stop the pain. Well, she was brought into this experimental protocol, and when I interviewed her 6 months later, she had taken a job working in childcare for the US Navy. She had left the abusive husband, and she said to me, my kids are so much happier now. She said, there's one room in my new place for the boys and one room for the girls, but at night they're just all up on my bed and we're doing homework all together and everything. One of them wants to be a preacher, one of them wants to be a firefighter, and one of the girls says she's going to be a lawyer. They don't cry like they used to, and they don't fight like they did. That's all I need now, is my kids. Things keep on changing. The way I dress, the way I feel, the way I act. I can go outside not being afraid anymore. And I don't think those bad feelings are coming back. And if it weren't for Dr. Miranda and that, I would still be at home with the covers pulled over my head, if I were still alive at all. I asked the Lord to send me an angel, and he heard my prayers. I was really moved by these experiences, and I decided that I wanted to write about them, not only in a book I was working on, but also in an article. And so I got a commission from the New York Times Magazine to write about depression among the indigent. And I turned in my story, and my editor called me and said, we really can't publish this. And I said, why not? And she said, it just is too far-fetched. These people who are sort of at the very bottom rung of society, and then they get a few months of treatment, and they're virtually ready to run Morgan Stanley. It's just too implausible. She said, I've never even heard of anything like it. And I said, the fact that you've never heard of it is an indication that it is news. And you are a news magazine. So after a certain amount of negotiation, they agreed to it. But I think a lot of what they said was connected in some strange way to this distaste that people still have for the idea of treatment, the notion that somehow if we went out and treated a lot of people in indigent communities, that would be an exploitative thing to do because we would be changing them. There's this false moral imperative that seems to be all around us, that treatment of depression, the medications and so on, are an artifice and that it's not natural. And I think that's very misguided. It would be natural for people's teeth to fall out, but there is nobody militating against toothpaste, at least not in my circles. And people then say, well, but isn't depression part of what people are supposed to experience? Didn't we evolve to have depression? Isn't it part of your personality? To which I would say, mood is adaptive. Being able to have sadness and fear and joy and pleasure and all of the other moods that we have, that's incredibly valuable. And major depression is something that happens when that system gets broken. It's maladaptive. People will come to me and say, I think, though, if I just stick it out for another year, I think I can just get through this. And I always say to them, you may get through it, but you'll never be 37 again. Life is short. And that's a whole year you're talking about giving up. Think it through. It's a strange poverty of the English language, and indeed of many other languages, that we use the same word, depression, to describe how a kid feels when it rains on his birthday, and to describe how somebody feels the minute before they commit suicide. People say to me, well, is it continuous with normal sadness? And I say, in a way, it's continuous with normal sadness. There is a certain amount of continuity, but it's the same way there's continuity between having an iron fence outside your house that gets a little rust spot that you have to sort of sand off and maybe do a little repainting, and what happens if you leave the house for 100 years and it rusts through until it's only a pile of orange dust. And it's that orange dust spot, that orange dust problem, that's the one we're setting out to address. So now people say, you take these happy pills and do you feel happy? And I don't. But I don't feel sad about having to eat lunch, and I don't feel sad about my answering machine, and I don't feel sad about taking a shower. I feel more, in fact, I think, because I can feel sadness without nullity. I feel sad about professional disappointments, about damaged relationships, about global warming. Those are the things that I feel sad about now. And I said to myself, well, what is the conclusion? How did those people who have better lives, even with bigger depression, manage to get through? What is the mechanism of resilience? And what I came up with over time was that the people who deny their experience, the ones who say, I was depressed a long time ago and I never want to think about it again and I'm not going to look at it and I'm just going to get on with my life, ironically, those are the people who are most enslaved by what they have. Shutting out the depression strengthens it. While you hide from it, it grows. And the people who do better are the ones who are able to tolerate the fact that they have this condition. Those who can tolerate their depression are the ones who achieve resilience. So Frank Russakoff said to me, if I had it to do over, I suppose I wouldn't do it this way. But in a strange way, I'm grateful for what I've experienced. I'm glad to have been in the hospital 40 times. It taught me so much about love, and my relationship with my parents and my doctors has been so precious to me and will be always. And Maggie Robbins said, I used to volunteer in an AIDS clinic, and I would just talk and talk and talk. And the people I was dealing with weren't very responsive, and I thought, that's not very friendly or helpful of them. And then I realized that they weren't going to do more than make those first few minutes of small talk. It was simply going to be an occasion where I didn't have AIDS and I wasn't dying, but could tolerate the fact that they did, and they were. Our needs are our greatest assets. It turns out I've learned to give all the things I need. Valuing one's depression does not prevent a relapse, but it may make the prospect of relapse, and even relapse itself, easier to tolerate. The question is not so much of finding great meaning and deciding your depression has been very meaningful. It's of seeking that meaning and thinking when it comes again, this will be hellish, but I will learn something from it. I had learned in my own depression how big an emotion can be, how it can be more real than facts. And I have found that that experience has allowed me to experience positive emotion in a more intense and more focused way. The opposite of depression is not happiness, but vitality. And these days, my life is vital, even on the days when I'm sad. I felt that funeral in my brain, and I sat next to the Colossus at the edge of the world. And I have discovered something inside of myself that I would have to call a soul, that I had never formulated until that day 20 years ago when hell came to pay me a surprise visit. I think that while I hated being depressed and would hate to be depressed again, I found a way to love my depression. I love it because it has forced me to find and cling to joy. I love it because each day I decide, sometimes gamely and sometimes against the moment's reason, to cleave to the reasons for living. And that, I think, is a highly privileged rapture. Thank you.
So let's move on to the current state of practice. There are several therapeutic approaches, both psychological and pharmacological, that have been utilized extensively for the treatment of depression. And they have been studied throughout multiple randomized controlled trials and meta analyses. So we'll review them briefly. The first one is cognitive behavioral therapy. That theorizes that distress arises in part due to dysfunctional thinking. And I'm oversimplifying things, but theoretically, that's the main mechanism of action in terms of why individuals experience depression. So CBT actively works to identify and restructure an individual's dysfunctional thoughts or underlying schemas to reduce distress. Interpersonal psychotherapy was developed in the 70s by Weissman and Clareman, and that model derives from social attachment theory as well as other theoretical models that posit distress arises from some interpersonal issue, for example, grief. So the goal of that treatment is to identify and address interpersonal distress in one or more of 4 problem areas: grief, role transition, and so forth. And then we have pharmacological agents such as selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, or SSRIs, which have been used for the treatment of depression, both in adolescents and adults.
Well, I think this is a challenge. In one sentence, why and how do you think cognitive therapy works?
Well, first of all,
I think it's a great question.
I think it's a terrific question, and the question is, what is cognitive therapy? And so cognitive therapy is not just a box of techniques. It's not a toolbox any more than, let's say, the Taj Mahal could be considered just a toolbox. Cognitive therapy is actually an architecture. And in order to understand cognitive therapy, you have to understand the blueprint that is provided the architecture. Once you know the blueprint, then you can use the tools, and then you can build a building, or you can build a therapy based on that. So the theory of cognitive therapy, very briefly, is that individuals in the course of their development experience certain vulnerabilities. And these vulnerabilities can be symbolized by maladaptive attitudes. So one of the vulnerabilities that somebody might have is, if I talk in public, people are going to ridicule me. Or if I try something hard, I'm not going to be able to make it. And over a period of time, with some individuals, these particular attitudes become fortified and kind of translocated. They tend to permeate the individual's whole personality. And so you get, in some cases, what you call personality disorder, because these dysfunctional beliefs are so deeply encrusted that they kind of dominate the individual's interactions and adjustments. So that's kind of what happens in the Axis 2 disorders. And the Axis 1 disorders, particularly depression, which we've been seeing now, is that these negative attitudes that people have had over time become activated as a result of something that happens, a whole series of things that impinge on their specific vulnerabilities, on their dysfunctional attitudes. And then, as a result of that, they start to see things in a biased way. So they go then from biased attitudes, such as I'm no good, to the biased perception, which is people don't listen to me, it means I'm no good. And the perception itself then is twisted. It's not based on evidence, but it's based on internal factors. So how does cognitive therapy work? Well, cognitive therapy works by virtue of its changing certain key elements in this theoretical construction that I just gave you. It works through changing the negative. In the case of depression, it works in changing the negative perceptions so that the person no longer sees things in terms of black and white, which is mainly black. And it more basically, it changes the biased beliefs, such as I'm no good, or I'm a failure, or I'm unlovable, and so on. So when we do studies of the efficacy of cognitive therapy, and we look for what accounts for the change, the improvement in cognitive therapy, we find that there's been a change in the basic attitudes and also in the perceptions. So if you give people a test, we used to do this with a binocular test, and in a binocular test there are two images that are shown, one for each eye. And when there are competing images coming into the eye, then certain psychological factors determine which of the two images you see. It's something called binocular rivalry. When people are depressed and you see two images, they're going to see the negative image. When they get over the depression, they're going to see the positive image. So that even at a perceptual level, cognitive therapy or any therapy that works is going to change not only the beliefs but also the perceptions. Now, if you'd like, I could tell you the kind of pictures. You interested? Okay. So one of the pictures we had when we did the study is we had a table. There was a table, and there's a group of people sitting around the table, and there are several vases with flowers, and the people are all smiling and happy. Then the companion picture is matched for the density. However, around the table on the table is a coffin. And the same number of people are looking at the coffin instead of the flowers, and they all look very sad. So the depressed person will see the sad picture. Interesting, not by choice, but happens automatically, sees the bad picture, but doesn't see the good one. When they're treated successfully, the bad picture goes away and they only see the good one. So this shows that at the most primitive level, people who are depressed see things negatively. So how does cognitive therapy work? It changes the negative image. How does it change the negative image? By getting at the basic negative beliefs, which is kind of a simplified way of putting it, but I think that my way of thinking is the way it works.
So this brief snippet, it's a YouTube video, is a video of Aaron Beck, who developed cognitive therapy. And it's only about 6 minutes long, but it provides a very nice description of how cognitive therapy works. All right, so you may be thinking, well, there are very effective pharmacologic and psychological treatments available. Is there a need for emerging programs and practice models? And the answer is yes, for several reasons. The first is that typically it takes time for these treatments to be effective. SSRIs, for example, can take between 6 weeks and 2 months before an individual experiences some relief. The second are treatment demands. So both cognitive behavioral therapy and interpersonal psychotherapy require weekly attendance and homework between sessions, which may not be feasible for some clients. Now, IPT has actually moved from, I believe, a 16-week model to they have abbreviated versions, such as an 8-week model, and for adolescents, even a 3-session IPT model. But still, it does require a commitment on the client's behalf. The third point is that there are high dropout rates for these therapies. And if you look at your readings, Cooper describes such that there is a substantial dropout associated with some of these therapeutic approaches. And they don't work for everyone. So it's been estimated that 30% of individuals who are prescribed an SSRI do not experience a remittance of depressive symptoms. Additionally, side effects are a big concern. So medications may have side effects and high rates of noncompliance because of that. And they're contraindicated for some groups. So SSRIs in particular have been given the black box warning. And that's the strongest warning a medication can receive because it has been associated with an increase in suicidality amongst adolescents. Access is another issue. There are very few providers available that are certified or trained in IPT or CBT and that accept insurance for that individuals who are the most likely to experience depression, so poverty impacted groups, are unlikely to have access to these services. However, in community clinics as well, there is in general a deficit with respect to certified CBT and IPT clinicians. And part of this is, again, when we think about a larger issue of does the organization support the integration of these models? Can they afford the training and supervision that goes along with it? So begin to also think organizationally beyond the individual in terms of the feasibility of some of these approaches. They may not be feasible in terms of having clinicians trained in these models. And also there's the big issue of access in general. So very few individuals who need mental health services actually receive them and receive them in a quality dosage. So we know with children who have an identified mental health need, only 20% receive or initially engage in mental health services, and then 75% are expected to drop out prematurely. So we're going to move now to 3 practice models or types of practices that might address some of these issues that make CBT, IPT, and SSRIs inaccessible or not feasible or not the best treatment for certain individuals. The first is electroconvulsive therapy, and this may be familiar to most of you. You may have heard of ECT. It was actually invented in the 1930s in Italy. It went out of favor in the 60s and 70s, and now it's experiencing a resurgence. And the theoretical or the basic premise underlying ECT is that you're using electricity to create seizures in the brain. And the individual is under an anesthetic, but that those brain seizures are somehow connected with depression and the remittance of depressive symptoms. So there are 3 competing theories of ECT, and they're all similar in that they all focus on brain activity and the effect of the seizure upon different parts of the brain. And that might include the seizure occurring across the entire brain or in the limbic system, or that ECT regulates dysfunction in the neuroendocrine system. So the theory behind this premise is that individuals who experience depression abnormally secrete cortisol, and ECT targets that and regulates it. A little bit about administration and the effect. So ECT can be administered both on an in and outpatient basis. The individuals may receive between 6 to 12 sessions on average, although they can receive up to 20 sessions. And you may possibly receive maintenance ECT, so every couple of months going in for an additional session. It's very safely controlled at this point, so the individual receives an anesthetic and a muscle relaxer, and they're under anesthetic for about 5 to 10 minutes. The seizure is administered, and then they wake up, so to speak. And what is promising is that it's possible to experience remittance after 2 to 4 treatments. So this YouTube video, again another TED Talk, is a great example from Sean Newland, who was a surgeon, and I believe he was also a writer, but he spoke a little bit about the effects of ECT for his intractable depression.
I'd like to do pretty much what I did the first time, which is to choose a lighthearted theme. Last time I talked about death and dying. This time I'm going to talk about mental illness. But it has to be technological, so I'll talk about electroshock therapy. You know, ever since man had any notion that some of his other people, his colleagues, could be different, could be strange, could be severely depressed, or what we now recognize as schizophrenia, he was certain that this kind of illness had to come from evil spirits getting into the body. So the way of treating these diseases in early times was to, in some way or other, exorcise those evil spirits, and this is still going on, as you know. But it wasn't enough to use the priests. When medicine became somewhat scientific in about 450 BC with Hippocrates and those boys, they tried to look for herbs, plants, that would literally shake the bad spirits out. So they found certain plants that could cause convulsions. And the herbals, the botanical books of up to the late Middle Ages, the Renaissance, are filled with prescriptions for causing convulsions to shake the evil spirits out. Finally, in about the 16th century, a physician whose name was Theophrastus Bombastus Oracularis von Hohenheim, called Paracelsus, a name probably familiar to some people here, good old Paracelsus, found that he could predict the degree of convulsion by using a measured amount of camphor to produce the convulsion. Can you imagine going in your closet, pulling out a mothball, chewing on it if you're feeling depressed? It's better than Prozac, but I wouldn't recommend it. So what we see in the 17th, 18th century is the continued search for medications other than camphor that'll do the trick. Well, along comes Benjamin Franklin. He comes close to convulsing himself with a bolt of electricity off the end of his kite. And so people begin thinking in terms of electricity to produce convulsions. And then we fast forward to about 1932, when 3 Italian psychiatrists who were largely treating depression began to notice among their patients who were also epileptics that if they had a series of epileptic fits, a lot of them in a row, the depression would very frequently lift. Not only would it lift, but it might never return. So they got very interested in producing convulsions, measured types of convulsions, and they thought, well, we've got electricity, we'll plug somebody into the wall. That always makes hair stand up and people shake a lot. So they tried it on a few pigs, and none of the pigs were killed. So they went to the police, and they said, we know that at the Rome railroad station, there are all these lost souls wandering around, muttering gibberish. Can you bring one of them to us? Someone who is, as the Italians say, caguz. So they found this caguz guy, a 39-year-old man, who was really hopelessly schizophrenic, who was known, had been known for months to be literally defecating on himself, talking nothing that made any sense, and they brought him into the hospital. So these 3 psychiatrists, after about 2 or 3 weeks of observation, laid him down on a table, connected his temples to a very small source of current. They thought, well, we'll try 55 volts, 0.2 of a second. That's not going to do anything terrible to him, so they did that. Well, I have the following from a first-hand observer who told me this about 35 years ago when I was thinking about these things for some research project of mine. He said, this fellow, remember, he wasn't even put to sleep, after this major grand mal convulsion, sat right up, looked at these 3 fellows and said, what the fuck are you assholes trying to do? If I could only say that in Italian. Well, they were happy as could be because he hadn't said a rational word in the weeks of observation. So they plugged him in again, and this time they used 110 volts for half a second. And to their amazement, after it was over, he began speaking like he was perfectly well. He relapsed a little bit. They gave him a series of treatments. And he was essentially cured, but of course, having schizophrenia, within a few months it returned. But they wrote a paper about this, and everybody in the Western world began using electricity to convulse people who were either schizophrenic or severely depressed. It didn't work very well on the schizophrenics, but it was pretty clear in the 30s and by the middle of the 40s that electroconvulsive therapy was very, very effective in the treatment of depression. And of course, in those days, there were no antidepressant drugs, and it became very, very popular. They would anesthetize people, convulse them, but the real difficulty was that there was no way to paralyze muscles. So people would have a real grand mal seizure. Bones were broken, especially in old, fragile people. You couldn't use it. And then in the 1950s, late 1950s, the so-called muscle relaxants were developed by pharmacologists. And it got so that you could induce a complete convulsion, an electroencephalographic convulsion. You could see it on the brain waves without causing any convulsion in the body except a little bit of twitching of the toe. So again, it was very, very popular, very, very useful. Well, you know, in the middle 60s, the first antidepressants came out. Tofranol was the first. In the late 70s, early 80s, there were others, and they were very effective. And patients' rights groups seemed to get very upset about the kinds of things that they would witness. And so the whole idea of electroconvulsive electroshock therapy disappeared, but has had a renaissance in the last 10 years. And the reason that it has had a renaissance is that probably about 10% of people, severe depressives, do not respond regardless of what is done for them. Now, why am I telling you this story at this meeting? I'm telling you this story because actually ever since Richard called me and asked me to talk about, as he asked all of the speakers to talk about something that would be new to this audience that we have never talked about, never written about, I've been planning this moment. The reason really is that I am a man who almost 30 years ago had his life saved by 2 long courses of electroshock therapy. And let me tell you this story. I was, in the 1960s, in a marriage. To use the word bad would be perhaps the understatement of the year. It was dreadful. There are, I'm sure, enough divorced people in this room to know about the hostility, the anger, who knows what. Being someone who had had a very difficult childhood, a very difficult adolescence, it had to do with not quite poverty, but close. It had to do with being brought up in a family where no one spoke English, no one could read or write English. It had to do with death and disease and lots of other things. I was a little prone to depression. So as things got worse, as we really began to hate each other, I became progressively depressed over a period of a couple of years, trying to save this marriage, which was inevitably not to be saved. Finally, I was scheduled, my major surgical cases, I was scheduling them for 1 o'clock in the afternoon because I couldn't get out of bed before about 11 o'clock. Anybody who's been depressed here knows what that's like. I couldn't even pull the covers off myself. Well, you're in a university medical center where everybody knows everybody, and it's perfectly clear to my colleagues, so my referrals began to decrease. As my referrals began to decrease, I clearly became increasingly depressed until I thought, my God, I can't work anymore. And in fact, it didn't make any difference because I didn't have any patients anymore. So, with the advice of my physician, I had myself admitted to the acute care psychiatric unit of our university hospital. And my colleagues who had known me since medical school in that place said, "Don't worry, Shep, 6 weeks, you're back in the operating room. Everything's going to be great." Well, you know what bovine stercus is? That proved to be a lot of bovine stercus. I know some people who got tenure in that place with lies like that. So I was one of their failures. But it wasn't that simple, because by the time I got out of that unit, I was not functional at all. I could hardly see 5 feet in front of myself. I shuffled when I walked. I was bowed over. I rarely bathed. I sometimes didn't shave. It was dreadful. And it was clear not to me, because nothing was clear to me at that time anymore, that I would need long-term hospitalization in that awful place called a mental hospital. So I was admitted in 1973, in the spring of 1973, to the Institute of Living, which used to be called the Hartford Retreat. It was founded in the 18th century, the largest psychiatric hospital in the state of Connecticut, other than the huge public hospitals that existed at that time. And they tried everything they had. They tried the usual psychotherapy. They tried every medication available in those days. And they did have tofranil and other things, Mellaril, who knows what. Nothing happened except that I got jaundiced from one of these things. And finally, because I was well known in Connecticut, they decided they better have a meeting of the senior staff. All the senior staff got together, and I later found out what happened. They put their heads together, and they decided that there was nothing that could be done for this surgeon who had essentially separated himself from the world, who by that time had become so overwhelmed, not just with depression and feelings of worthlessness and inadequacy, but with obsessional thinking. Obsessional thinking about coincidences, and there were particular numbers that every time I saw them just got me dreadfully upset. All kinds of ritualistic observances, just awful, awful stuff. Remember when you were a kid, you had to step on every line? Well, I was a grown man who had all of these rituals, and it got so there was a throbbing, there was a ferocious fear in my head. You've seen this painting by Edvard Munch, the scream, the scream. Every moment was a scream. It was impossible. So they decided there was no therapy. There was no treatment. But there was one treatment, which actually had been pioneered at the Hartford Hospital in the early 1940s. And you can imagine what it was. It was prefrontal lobotomy. So they decided, I didn't know this, again, I found this out later, that the only thing that could be done was for this 43-year-old man to have a prefrontal lobotomy. Well, as in all hospitals, there was a resident assigned to my case. He was 27 years old, and he would meet with me 2 or 3 times a week. And of course, I'd been there, 3 or 4 months at the time. And he asked to meet with the senior staff, and they agreed to meet with him because he was very well thought of in that place. They thought he had a really extraordinary future. And he dug in his heels and he said, "No, I know this man better than any of you. I have met with him over and over again. You've just seen him from time to time. You've read reports and so forth. I really honestly believe that the basic problem here is pure depression, and all of the obsessional thinking comes out of it. And you know, of course, what will happen if you do a prefrontal lobotomy. Any of the results along a spectrum from pretty bad to terrible, terrible, terrible is going to happen. If he does the best he can, he will have no further obsessions, probably no depression, but his affect will be dulled. He will never go back to surgery. He will never be the loving father that he was to his 2 children. His life will be changed. If he has the usual result, he'll end up like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. You know about that. Just essentially in a stupor the rest of his life. Well, he said, "Can't we try a course of electroshock therapy?" And you know why they agreed? They agreed to humor him. They just thought, well, we'll give a course of 10, and so we'll lose a little time. Big deal, it doesn't make any difference. So they gave the course of 10, and the usual course, incidentally, was 6 to 8, and it still is 6 to 8. Plugged me into the wires, put me to sleep, gave me the muscle relaxant. 6 didn't work, 7 didn't work, 8 didn't work. At 9, I noticed, it's wonderful that I could notice anything. I noticed a change, and at 10, I noticed a real change. And he went back to them, and they agreed to do another 10. Again, not a single one of them, I think there are about 7 or 8 of them, thought this would do any good. They thought this was a temporary change. But lo and behold, by 16, by 17, there were demonstrable differences in the way I felt. By 18 and 19, I was sleeping through the night, and by 20, I had the sense, I really had the sense that I could overcome this, that I was now strong enough that by an act of will, I could blow the obsessional thinking away. I could blow the depression away. And I've never forgotten, I never will forget, standing in the kitchen of the unit. It was a Sunday morning in January of 1974. Standing in the kitchen by myself and thinking, I've got the strength now to do this. It was as though those tightly coiled wires in my head had been disconnected, and I could think clearly, but I need a formula. I need something to say to myself when I begin thinking obsessively. Well, the Gilbert and Sullivan fans in this room will remember Ruddy Gore, and they will remember Mad Margaret, and they will remember that she was married to a fellow named Sir Despard Murgatroyd, and she used to go nuts every 5 minutes or so in the play. And he said to her, we must have a word to bring you back to reality, and the word, my dear, will be Basingstoke. So every time she got a little nuts, he would say, Basingstoke, and she would say, Basingstoke it is, and she'd be fine for a little while. Well, you know, I'm from the Bronx, I can't say Basingstoke. But I had something better. And it was very simple. It was, fuck it. Much better than Basingstoke, at least for me. And it worked, my God, it worked. Every time I would begin thinking obsessionally, again, once more after 20 shock treatments, I would say, fuck it. And things got better and better. Within 3 or 4 months, I was discharged from that hospital. I joined a group of surgeons where, you know, I could work with other people in a community, not in New Haven, but fairly close by. Stayed there for 3 years. At the end of 3 years, I went back to New Haven, had remarried by that time. I brought my wife with me, actually, to make sure I could get through this. My children came back to live with us. We had 2 more children after that. Resuscitated the career, even better than it had been before. Went right back into the university and began to write books. Well, you know, it's been a wonderful life. It's been, as I say, close to 30 years. I stopped doing surgery about 6 years ago and became a full-time writer, as many people know. But it's been very exciting. It's been very happy. Every once in a while, I have to say, fuck it. Every once in a while, I get somewhat depressed, a little obsessional. So I'm not free of all of this. But it's worked. It's always worked. Why have I chosen, after never, ever talking about this, to talk about it now? Well, those of you who know some of these books know that one is about death and dying, one is about the human body and the human spirit, one is about the way mystical thoughts are constantly in our minds, and they have always to do with my own personal experiences. One might think, reading these books, and I've gotten thousands of letters about them by people who do think this, that based on my life's history as I portrayed in the books, my early life's history, I am someone who has overcome adversity. That I am someone who has drank of the bitter dregs of near disaster in childhood and emerged not just unscathed, but strengthened. I really have it figured out so that I can advise people about death and dying, so that I can talk about mysticism and the human spirit, and I've always felt guilty about that. I've always felt that somehow I was an imposter because my readers don't know what I have just told you. It's known by some people in New Haven, obviously, but it is not generally known. So one of the reasons that I have come here to talk about this today is to, frankly, selfishly unburden myself and let it be known that this is not an untroubled mind that has written all of these books. But more importantly, I think, is the fact that a very significant proportion of people in this audience are under 30. And there are many, of course, who are well over 30. For people under 30, and it looks to me like almost all of you, I would say all of you, are either on the cusp of a magnificent and exciting career or right into a magnificent and exciting career. Anything can happen to you. Things change. Accidents happen. Something from childhood comes back to haunt you. You can be thrown off the track. I hope it happens to none of you, but it will probably happen to a small percentage of you. To those to whom it doesn't happen, there will be adversities. If I, with the bleakness of spirit, with no spirit that I had in the 1970s, and no possibility of recovery as far as that group of very experienced psychiatrists thought, if I can find my way back from this, believe me, anybody can find their way back from any adversity that exists in their lives. And for those who are older, who have lived through, perhaps not something as bad as this, but who have lived through difficult times, perhaps where they lost everything, as I did, and started out all over again, some of these themes will seem very familiar. There is recovery. There is redemption. And there is resurrection. There are resurrection themes in every society that has ever been studied, and it is because not just only do we fantasize about the possibility of resurrection and recovery, but it actually happens, and it happens a lot. Perhaps the most popular resurrection theme outside of specifically religious ones is the one about the phoenix, the ancient story of the phoenix who every 500 years resurrects itself from its own ashes to go on to live a life that is even more beautiful than it was before. Richard, thanks very much.
So when you critically appraise the evidence, you're looking at, again, based upon have randomized controlled trials been conducted of this intervention or treatment? Is there a meta-analysis available? Systematic review. So if you remember from Module 3, yes, it was Module 3, that there are different levels of evidence, and while there are different ways in which we assess the evidence, so we presented 2 of those models, there was some similarity in that meta-analyses, systematic reviews, randomized controlled trials tended to be at a higher level of evidence. And what we found with ECT doing a literature search is that there have been multiple reviews, and there's actually there's a meta-analysis that was done that did 2 things. It first looked at randomized controlled trials that compared ECT with different intervention arms or a placebo. Okay. And what is particularly important about that review is that they were comparing ECT with other effective known therapeutic interventions for depression, so antidepressants. And they found that ECT was clinically superior than the comparison arms. So in comparison to simulated ECT, placebos, and antidepressants. And then they did a review of non-randomized controlled trials, so quasi-experimental, and they compared ECT with antidepressants. And there were 14 studies that had that kind of design, and they found, again, ECT was superior than antidepressants in the remittance of depression. Okay, so the second practice model I'd like to introduce you to is ketamine. And ketamine was used in the Vietnam War as an anesthetic, and it's currently used as an anesthetic for children and for animals. But it's also been tested on adults with depression, and there's over almost 2 decades of research on this model. The theory underlying ketamine as an effective therapeutic agent is incomplete, but part of the theory suggests that because it's a glutamatergic agent, it theorizes that depression is caused by glutamatergic signaling in the brain that is dysfunctional. So ketamine directly targets that. However, what we don't know about ketamine is, or why, is that the effects of this this medication remain after most of it has been excreted out from the body, suggesting that there are other mechanisms at play. And this is a treatment that has been used predominantly for severe depression, or treatment-resistant depression. And that is depression that is not shown any kind of remittance from, say, CBT, SSRIs, or the conventional therapeutic approaches. So ketamine has a lot of momentum behind it right now. There are multiple methods of administration: orally, intravenously, intranasally, subcutaneously. And the procedure is pretty similar despite how it is administered, in that the individual is in the medical facility for approximately 40 minutes, and they are monitored very closely. They receive a sub-anesthetic dosage, and the number of sessions depends on the individual and their response, the dosage, and so forth. And as soon as the ketamine leaves the body, the individual experiences a remittance of depression, albeit a very short-term one, which we'll talk about in a bit. Now, there's a short video on YouTube that I pulled up, which is informative as to how ketamine actually works, and what you would need to know in terms of administration. Here, too, in analyzing the evidence, there was a meta-analysis recently done by McGurr et al. And what I want to point your attention to is that depression was assessed both through self-report, which has been is not considered the most methodologically rigorous way to assess the presence of a mental health condition, but sometimes, and usually it's all that we have, as well as clinician-related. And 7 RCTs compared ketamine with placebo and found that it was superior to the comparison treatments at 3 time points, so 24 hours after administration, 3 days, and 1 week later. Okay, so the third practice model is actually a group of interventions or approaches that are referred to as complementary and alternative medicine. And they're grouped as CAM because they're not considered conventional treatments for a given disease or condition. And there's different types. There's ingestible, such as St. John's wort, supplements, folate, chromium. There's mind-body treatments such as exercise, relaxation strategies, acupuncture, yoga. Meditation goes along with this, and later in the semester we'll talk a great deal about meditation, and aromatherapy. Here too, there's momentum behind looking seriously at CAM approaches. So a recent study found that over half of individuals with depression used one or more types of complementary and alternative medicine. Exercise alone has really become the standout in terms of the research literature that suggests that rigorous exercise can be as effective as therapy and an SSRI for individuals with mild and possibly moderate depression. And the theory behind how these approaches work vary based upon what the approach is. So aromatherapy has one specific theoretical model behind it. Other, like exercise, has another. Like the theory behind CAM, how it varies based on approach, it just makes sense that administration would also vary. And this becomes complicated when you would like to assess the body of literature on a given approach. So for example, if you were looking to assess the effectiveness of aromatherapy, it would matter what kind of aromatherapeutic agents you utilized and how they were administered on the skin, intranasally, for how long, and so on and so forth. So because of that, standardization and really finding a consistent result across the literature is difficult. So not surprisingly, the results are inconsistent. There are clearer results for exercise and, interestingly enough, St. John's wort, but for other approaches, particularly if the method of administration, again, and all these other factors vary between study or across studies, it becomes very difficult to compare studies with each other, and you will find inconsistencies across the literature. So, how do these programs and practice models address gaps in current treatment? So, first of all, we know that a substantial number of individuals are being drawn to complementary and alternative medicines as either an adjunctive component or the sole treatment for depression. So, there's real public interest in moving this research forward because we need to know about the effectiveness of these approaches. Because there's a lot of buy-in for them. We also are encouraged by ECT and ketamine in that they're both very fast-acting treatments, although ketamine does wear off quickly, so it's not unusual for someone to have to go back to the medical facility on a consistent basis to receive another dosage. One of the pros with that, though, is that because administration is done at a facility, non-compliance with that agent is not going to be an issue. Now, they might not show up, and that's a separate access issue, but they're not going to be non-compliant with receiving ketamine. In addition, many studies of CAM are less rigorous, but again, for exercise and St. John's wort, they are showing promise as effective therapies. And it's important to keep in mind that with some of these forms of CAM, there's little to no side effects. That being said, there are considerable side effects for ECT and ketamine. And those include for ECT, confusion upon waking, possible headache, memory loss. Memory loss is a big one. Usually individuals who receive ECT do not remember or lose their short-term memory. And it can affect their heart rhythm. There's also a potential for abuse or misuse. Even though ketamine is administered in a laboratory setting or a medical facility, outside of that, there's a potential for misuse. They're both invasive, so they're ingested into the body. It could be done through a variety of ways, but there is an invasive component to them. And critically, some types of complementary and alternative medicine, like St. John's wort, can also interfere with other therapeutic interventions or medications. So this is where we need to start thinking critically about these approaches and whether they are acceptable and better substitutes for existing therapeutic interventions, or can they be used in addition to? So as we talked about earlier in this module, CBT and IPT, as well as SSRIs, are not for everyone. There are a fair number of individuals who do not receive therapeutic benefit from conventional treatments. Does that then, in terms of an ethical and a treatment decision approach, does it then make sense for them to try one of these more invasive therapies, such as ketamine or ECT? We also know that ECT and ketamine are used for very severe depression, as well as treatment-resistant depression. So it may be that this is not a frontline approach, but a secondary one in the case of refractory depression. One of your readings by Lewandowski et al. Talks about the pathway of diagnosis and treatment of depression based upon severity. And it may mean that this is an approach that we start to consider for those individuals who have the most difficulty dealing with very severe, unremitting depressive symptoms. So it's something to think about. Ethical issues, particularly with respect to ketamine, which can be, there is a potential for misuse. Are we creating additional problems? Again, there is a lot of buy-in for ketamine. At Yale, for example, the Department of Psychiatry is really moving forward in trials to study ketamine administered intranasally. And again, it's a sub-anesthetic dosage, but there is risk involved. as well as risk to being, if it's intravenous or because it's invasive, there's also side effects and so forth. We know with the meta-analyses that have been done that they are superior to, or at least ketamine and ECT, to alternative therapeutic approaches and placebos. CAMS, the research isn't as clear. It's inconsistent. And again, that calls into question standardization. So when you start to think about these approaches and adoption of them, what would you need to do that? Does the evidence as it exists paint a picture that suggests, yes, this is a treatment that I should adopt or that my agency should adopt? Do we have the, and I don't know how else to say it, but do we have everything in place to administer it? Do we have the space? Do we have the medical technology? Do we have all of these factors together which are needed in order to effectively administer this medication or this treatment? So those are also things that you would want to think about. Are these therapeutic approaches reimbursable? So CAMS, for example, is St. John's wort something that's reimbursable through your agency? If it's not, then it's a consideration fiscally. So again, when you're starting to think about the larger implications of these models, and not just for depression, but throughout the semester, these are some of the questions you would want to ask. Are there more studies that need to be done? Do we need to standardize the treatment, especially CAM treatments, so we can see if there's a discernible effect? So again, before we're introducing these practices into community settings, does more efficacy and effectiveness research need to be conducted? Okay. It's also critical when you're looking at the studies that do exist. What do we know about the individuals who participated in those trials? Do we know anything about their income status? Do we know anything about their gender, their race? All of these things matter because if you are an evidence-based practitioner and you are using the evidence in conjunction with practice wisdom and the needs of your client, you absolutely want to consider those factors. Well, yes, it's been shown to be very effective amongst women of this given age and so on and so forth, gives you some sort of reassurance that it is translatable to your demographic if you're working with women. Okay? So again, as we move through the semester, it's important for you to become critical thinkers regarding the evidence that does exist, what we know about it, and every research study has flaws. So maybe it's not tested on populations in which we are working, and that is a consideration for adoption. All right, so that ends our discussion on depression. Remember, you have an online post that you'll need to complete this week in the chats folder. Next week, we start our presentations of the group experience regarding an ethical dilemma or issue, and going through the set of questions that are on your syllabus.